Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You know, David Edgar asked me to speak tonight on the subject of what we can learn from Europe. And he actually published in the program that I was going to speak on the subject of what we can learn from Europe. So, David, what can we learn from Europe? Nothing. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Is that all right? Will that do it? Can I go home now? Yeah, I'm finished, yeah. No. Oh, shoot, I'll have to think of something else to talk about. You know, I wasn't going to mention this, but the first newspaper I ever worked on, I was writing a story about something or other, and I didn't get the facts quite right, and I wasn't sure of something. And my editor said to me, "We have a rule here, when in doubt, leave out." The next newspaper I worked on was a rather better newspaper, and when I slightly tried to fudge something in a story, the chief reporter said to me, "We have a rule here, when in doubt, find out." And in the spirit of when in doubt, find out, I can assure you that that bar that Bill was talking about really is a gay bar. But I still, deep down, have this kind of lurking suspicion that there's a Trappist brewery in Kokomo, Indiana, you know. I'll never quite get this lurking suspicion out of my system. I occasionally wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat thinking, there's a brewery, that Trappist brewery, and I haven't been to it. And I think if they published that story again, I'd probably be on the phone again trying to get down there. I actually did, when I was researching the World Guide to Beer back in the early to mid-1970s, I actually did write to a Trappist brewery in the United States, asking them if there was any record of Trappist breweries or of Trappist monasteries in the United States ever having brewed. And, you know, they didn't know who the hell I was, and I hadn't written any books at the time. And they wrote me a very nice letter back saying that they really regretted that they didn't brew and that none of the other Trappist monasteries in the United States brewed either, but that they thought it was a pretty good idea and maybe one day they would. So it was a really nice letter for them to write to me, and I always wondered when I read that story, which was written by the story was written by Jim Dorsch, who at the time was my colleague. I mean, still a friend and colleague, but at the time we were actually collaborating on a website together. So not only did I fall for an April Fool's joke, but it was also perpetrated by my immediate colleague. I'm not going to talk about what we can learn from Europe, because I don't really think we can learn anything from Europe at the moment. In the great brewing countries of Europe, the Czech Republic is rather letting its brewing tradition slip through its fingers. The Germans are not doing a great job of protecting their brewing traditions. The Belgians, I think, are doing a reasonable job, and the British, kind of the jury's out on that one, I think, but sometimes doing a very good job and sometimes doing a terrible job. But I don't think there's an awful lot the American small brewing industry or specialist brewing industry can learn from what's going on in Europe. I think that, you know, the answers to what can be achieved are to be found right here. And I, having said to David I didn't want to talk about what we can learn from Europe, I said I'd prefer to talk about the coming upswing in craft brewing. And he thought that was a much better idea. But by then the program had been printed. When I think about this position of craft brewing in the United States, you know, I think about all of the years I've spent, over 20 years, on both sides of the Atlantic, in all of the countries I've mentioned, particularly this one, giving tutored tastings to try and spread the word about interesting beer. And one of the very simple questions you get when you try to plan a tutored tasting is that the person who's going to host it says to you, what order would you like the beers to go in? You know, would you like the beers to go from light to dark? And I say, well, you know, light and dark, that's color. Doesn't always work like that. But let's talk about intensity of flavor. I mean, it's just a normal thing you do, isn't it, with a beer tasting or any kind of tasting. You'd normally start off with the lightest tasting product and gradually work your way up to the most robust tasting product. And it's kind of difficult if you've got both, say, a lambic and an imperial stout in a tasting. It's kind of hard to figure out how you're going to handle that. But generally speaking, that's the way I do it. I start off with the lightest tasting product and work my way up to the most robust tasting. I once met somebody who did it the other way around. He would start off with an imperial stout and then sort of move from that to a brown ale or something, and then to a pale ale, and he'd gradually work his way back and finish up with Budweiser or Miller Lite. And I said, you know, why do you do that? And he said, because an awful lot of my audience, I can say to them, after they've, you know, they taste all of these beers, and then finally, at the end of it all, after they've tasted the imperial stout and the brown ale and the barley wine and the cherry porter and all the rest of it, and finally they finish up with Budweiser, and then I say to them, now until today you thought that was beer. And I think that was a very interesting approach to take. I mean, if you say to somebody, drinking a mainstream beer is all right, but it's not really a very interesting kind of beer, well, kind of that's your opinion, big mouth. But if you show them what interesting beer can be like, and then say, now this is what you've been drinking until today, you make a position very, very dramatically, I think. You make a point very dramatically. And I think about that when I think about the American consumers who have tasted specialty beers, whether they were specialty beers made by Anheuser-Busch or specialty beers made by contract brewers or regional brewers or microbrewers or brew pubs. Once you've tasted specialty beers and become used to them, you can't really go back. I mean, there's just no way back. It kind of reminds me of that song. You know, I make this not as an emotional point, but as a purely practical point. I mean, you can't get used to eating or drinking something with a lot of flavor and then go back if you've got any choice in the matter. It's just a practical thing. You become accustomed to something quite different. I always think of that song. I can't remember what the song is, but it has that line in it, how will you get the boys back to the farm after they've seen Paris? You know, that's how it seems to me. That's how it is with craft beers. I mean, once you've drunk craft beers, you can't go backwards. And we should remember, when we have our little sort of worries about how the industry is going, we should remember that there is no way back for people who become interested in craft beers. And we should remember that there was never anything weird about having small breweries. You know, I mean, there were small breweries long before there were large breweries. We've had beer for at least 6,000 years, and it wasn't until about 150 years ago that we had the beginnings of any kind of large breweries. It wasn't until 100 years ago that we had anything such as a national brewery. So what we're doing, and what we're still trying to develop, I hope, a larger public for, and that's where the upturn has to come from finding a larger public for what we're doing. What we're doing is not something weird, it's not something eccentric, it's not something unnatural or fattening or illegal or anything like that. What we're doing is making beer the way that beer has really always been made. And there's nothing, the reason I make this point, I mean, you know this, but are you telling people about this? I mean, are you explaining yourself? Are you explaining what small brewing is? Are you explaining to people that this is a normal, proper, historically validated way to make beer? We don't explain ourselves. The small brewing industry doesn't explain itself. The specialty brewing industry doesn't explain itself to the consumer. And now the time's come when we have to. The novelty's over now. So now we have to say why we're doing what we're doing and why it's worthwhile and why the consumer should care. If you don't tell him why he should care, then you're relying on the lucky few who are prescient enough or appreciative enough to have figured it out for themselves. And for every one person who's figured this out for themselves, for every one consumer who's figured it out for themselves, there are another 5 or 10 or 20 who need a little bit of help, need a bit of explanation. The same is true in respect to specialty beers. I mean, specialty beers aren't some kind of aberration. There's nothing to say that because 20 years ago it was almost impossible in the US to find anything other than a light lager There's nothing, therefore, to say that light lager is the only real beer and everything else is kind of unnatural and weird. But again, we don't really explain this. I mean, everything that we're doing, brewing with different grains, brewing with different flavors, brewing with different types of yeasts, it's all been done for 6,000 years. I mean, in 6,000 years, we've only had the hop as a flavoring for less than 1,000 of that, in terms of any definite proof that the hop's been used. The Mesopotamians used wheat, so wheat beer is not something new. They used honey, so honey beer is not something new. I mean, ever since the birth of Bill Owens, we've had pumpkin beer. So, I mean, we're talking about very, very long traditions here. And again, we're not really explaining this to the consumer, nor is it somehow unnatural or bizarre for an industry that was formerly dominated by giants, and that perhaps still is dominated by giants, to find itself accommodating smaller enterprises doing things in a different way. Every single consumer market has in the last 20 or 30 years segmented. You know, there used to be only sliced white bread. Now you go to a store and there are 100 different kinds of bread in a supermarket. There used to be only Wisconsin Jack. Now there are 100 kinds of cheese in the supermarket. There used to be only Folgers instant coffee. Now Starbucks have got something new every day. Coffee from here, coffee from there, roasted like this, flavored with this. I mean, it's an enormous range of possibilities, and the consumer is used to that. So what we're doing in beer, in segmenting the market and making specialty products, which is sometimes dismissed as niche products, it's not something weird and something unusual. It's something that's very, very logical. And again, we need to be explaining that. We need to be explaining it not only to the consumer, but also to the media. You know, the media, I'm part of the media. I mean, I'm talking about we as though I were a brewer. Well, I kind of feel sometimes like I am a brewer, but I'm also a part of the media. My whole life's work has been as a writer and as a newspaperman, as an author and a TV filmmaker, and I'm part of the media. The media pick up on things and play with them for a while like a cat with a mouse, and then get bored and gobble them up or throw them away or something. And so brewing, small brewing, specialty brewing is just somehow a craze or a fad or a momentary boom or something, but it's not. I mean, wine was the craze of the 70s. Wine hasn't gone away. You know, it's no longer talked about as much as it once was. It's still talked about a damn sight more than beer is. Wine hasn't gone away. All these varieties of cheese won't go away. All these varieties of bread won't go away. All the different kind of coffees you can buy won't go away. There was a time when TV was dominated by the big three networks. It was kind of yesterday, wasn't it? You know, now the networks are losing power like crazy because the TV's fragmented. The media itself has fragmented. How many computer magazines are there? How many motoring magazines are there? It's a natural, logical thing for mass markets to fragment. We no longer live in the Eisenhower era. You know, we no longer live in the time when all Americans apparently had white faces, and we're all apparently middle class, and all apparently lived behind picket fences and watched Father Knows Best and ate TV dinners on their knees. Those days of uniformity have gone, and they're not going to come back. And when people say to me, yeah, let's hear it for diversity. When people say to me, people used to say to me in the early days of the beer movement, you know, why is this happening? Why are we suddenly having all these small breweries? And I used to say, well, why did it take us so damn long? That's the question. Every other industry fragmented. Why did it take so long for the brewing industry to fragment? And when people talk about fragmentation just being niche markets. That sounds very dismissive, but in the future, a very large part of the market will comprise niches. Niches will be very significant because they'll really be the market. And I don't know how big it'll be, but if you look at the wine business, I talked to Market Watch and the Schenken organization's publication about this the other day, and I said, you know, what percentage of wine is sold is fine wine, and what percentage is jug wine? And I said, well, you know, fine wine, I mean, wine costing more than $7 a bottle, or wine costing more than $7 a bottle perhaps, or let's say wine costing more than $10 a bottle is maybe 20% of the market. Wine costing more than $7 a bottle is maybe 25% of the market. And I think that's the kind of share, somewhere between 20 and 25% of the market is a logical share for small breweries to have. I mean, that could be conservative, or for specialty beers to have anyway. I mean, that could be slightly conservative, but if you look at it, it's hard really to make analogies in other countries. People ask me what happens in Europe, and there's really no such place as Europe, but in Britain, rather over 40% of the market for beer is top fermenting beer, so you could call those specialty beers. In Belgium, it's about 30%. In Germany, it's about 30%. I think that this country, which is a much more adventurous country, and where some people are already drinking far more assertive beers than you could find anywhere in Europe, can at least match those kind of figures. I remember in the early days I was asked, I was constantly, I mean, people, when small breweries were first beginning in this country, I was constantly asked, you know, what the hell's happening here? And I mean, media people would always be asking me, I mean, how many breweries could we have? We've suddenly got all these small breweries, how many breweries could we have? And I used to say, well, you know, if there are, say, 50 major markets in the country, at least each one of them could support at least one microbrewery, so we could have 50 microbreweries. And I mean, I suppose each major market could support 2 or 3 brew pubs, so we could maybe have 150 brew pubs. So hell, we could have 200 small breweries in this country before long. And people looked at me as though I was mad, that I thought we could have that many. And now we're up to 1,500. Well, even if you take my sort of view and take a view of trying to divide the country into logical markets and say how many could you have in this market, how many could you have in that, I suppose it could be that 1,500 is just too damn many. But I'm damn sure we can have 750 to 1,000 breweries in this country in the long term. Part of what, you know, why does market fragmentation happen? It's really because the Industrial Revolution's over. Now, big brewing was born out of the Industrial Revolution. I'm not saying big brewing is going to go away, but we're living in a post-industrial age now. I mean, there isn't a hooter going in Pittsburgh at the end of the working day and suddenly thousands of people are pouring out of steelworks and going into bars and drinking 20 beers. Now, that kind of volume drinking is not going to happen in the future. There aren't any steelworks left in Pittsburgh. There aren't coal mines. There aren't those kind of plants. People work at computers, and if people work at computers, people who work at computers still want to drink at the end of the day. Sitting watching a green screen all day long sure as hell makes you want to have a beer. I know it does. When I sit at this green screen and I describe all these wonderful beers, it makes me want to have one. But at the end of the day of working on a computer, you don't want to have 20 beers. You want to have maybe 19 or 18. No, you want to have rather you want to have rather fewer beers, but you want to perhaps drink less but taste more, or drink less but taste better. And that's the real engine that drives the small brewery and specialty beer movement. But again, we're not making these connections. We're not really reaching out to people properly and saying, you know, when you feel like a beer at the end of the day and you really want something satisfying, well, you do want something satisfying. You don't want a light-tasting mass-market beer. You want something with more satisfaction, more character, more complexity. If you can explain this to people and hold their hands a little, they'll listen to you. But we're not explaining it. We're not doing a good enough job of explaining to the consumer. And we tend rather to take the view that all consumers are at the same point. Either they all like microbrewed beer or they all don't like microbrewed beer. And again, the media and Wall Street tend to kind of look at it in the same way. But it's not like that. I mean, the other day I was on a train going up to visit some people in Long Island, and I was with a young guy who was a TV program editor, and his girlfriend told him what I did for a living. And he said to me, I said, I'm a real beer lover. And I said, well, that's great. What do you like? And he said, Heineken. And I said, well, Heineken's okay, but I mean, it's not really that interesting a beer. I mean, if you're a real beer lover, you could try a few other things. And he said to me, well, what can I try? And we were in New York State, so I said, why don't you try Brooklyn Lager? And he said, I've kind of heard of that, but it couldn't be as good as Heineken, could it? I mean, there are people with that level of, quite sophisticated people with that kind of level of beer appreciation or lack of it out there. There are people we just haven't reached at all. Huge proportion of the population we just haven't reached at all. And nor is there, it's not like there's a simple, right now microbreweries are in fashion, right now imports are in fashion. It's not like that. I mean, it's more like a tide that goes in and out, and sometimes you can't really tell whether it's going in and out, in or out. I mean, there's been the original, back in the late 70s, imports began to be popular. Then there were micros, then there was Corona, then there were brew pubs. Then do you remember that phase of long neck Bud? There was a time when everybody was drinking long neck Bud. Then do you remember dry beer? Then ice beer. Ice beer was the thing to drink, ice beer. And then the term craft beer became the term people were using. And then there was another burst of Corona drinking. Very strange behavior, but it happened. And now there's supposedly now a fashion for imports again, and of course that's a fashion that has a sort of the top end of the fashion has a kind of Belgian accent to it. So it's never going to be a simple tide one way or the other. It's never going to be a simple tide of all taste for the same beer. There's never going to be a simple tide where everybody wants the same thing at the same time. But if at the moment the tide is running a little bit for imports, that'll educate people about beer. If people start drinking interesting Belgian imports, in another couple of years they'll start to want to drink more microbrewed beers. It always seems to last. It seems to work like it. It seems to come in sort of little bursts of 2 or 3 years, and I wonder why that is. I wonder if that's maybe that's the length of time people are at college, or it's the length of time that it takes for people from leaving college to settling down with a partner. I don't know. There are these little generational tides all the time. When the tide is our way, we really have to make sure that we ride that tide, and I think the tide's going to be going in our direction in maybe a year's time or 2 years' time, so we better be ready to ride it when it's like a surfer. We better be ready to ride that tide when it comes along, and we will do that, I think, if we can explain what we're doing with some confidence and with some logic and with some conviction. If every time the industry has an upswing, it's treated like some kind of scam as a way of making a lot of money, it ain't going to work. If every time the industry has an upswing, people try to capitalize on it by making novelty beers. It's all right making a hemp beer. That's fine, but you're not going to build a future on making a hemp beer. Sierra Nevada didn't build its future on making a hemp beer. Old Dominion didn't build its future on making a hemp beer. Anchor Steam didn't. The marketing men will always tell you that it doesn't really matter what's in the bottle. It's the package that counts. But it's very interesting when you look at the really successful microbreweries. The one thing they all seem to have in common is they make great beer. Could be a coincidence, I suppose, but I suspect that it's not. I think you have to make great beer. You really do have to make great beer. You have to present it with confidence. For me, that's more than anything else, that is the key. You've got to present your beers confidently, like you know what you know, you love your beers, you care about them, you know how you make them, you know what they are, you know why people should love them. You try to explain to other people why you love them and why they should love them. This is a little sidetrack, but if I had a brew pub, I would never sell anybody else's beers in a brew pub. My heart sinks when I go into a brew pub and I see lots of neons for Miller Lite and Coors Silver Bullet and so forth. Don't keep searching for magic formulae, whether it's in your pub or your beer or your packaging. So many breweries keep on changing everything all the time. I mean, if you meet your friend in a bar every night for a quiet beer and suddenly he arrives one night with an orange wig on, you think the guy's gone crazy. If you suddenly put an orange wig on your beer after making one kind of beer, it suddenly becomes orange wig beer, your consumers will think you've gone crazy. The marketing people will tell you that perceived quality is what counts, but rather than real quality. Perceived quality is not enough, it has to be real quality as well. Marketing people will tell you not to alienate your consumer. Well, I agree, but don't appease your consumer either. My heart sinks when I go into a brew pub and every beer has been dumbed down. Okay, have a crossover beer. Have a couple of crossover beers. But just in case I pop into your brew pub, have something I'd like to drink too, please. I suppose I'm just really returning all the time to this theme of confidence and consistency of product and consistency of knowing what you're doing and keeping on doing the same thing and being patient and using some shoe leather. And I think a part of that as well, the industry, and I think that Jim Cook talked about this, I believe, earlier in the week, but those are values that it's not enough just for one brewery to be espousing. The whole industry has to, as a group, espouse those values. The micro-brewed beer, not just your beer or his beer, but micro-brewed beer has to be something that is credible, believable, has intrinsic qualities that can be easily perceived. And that's a message that you all need to, all of us need to keep persistently banging away with. You can't just have flashes in the pan. It's got to be persistent. It's got to be tenacious. You've got to keep on and on and on trying to explain this to the public, to the consumer. I mean, craft beer had a lot of bridges to cross because of its unfamiliarity, but it does have a very strong foothold in the marketplace. I mean, it's there, it's out there, and although sometimes craft brews are badly made, it's far more often good than it is bad. I mean, I never really drink the sort of regular mainstream beers anyway, but I just wouldn't really consider going anywhere that didn't sell a craft beer. I just don't see the point. But we've reached a point now where this industry, in some parts of the country, this industry has been around for 20 years. Hard to believe, isn't it? But it's true. So I guess we're all grown-ups now, and we have to make real beer for real consumers and stop farting around.